I signed a piece of paper in my kitchen, thinking it was just a formality to let my brother-in-law coordinate a few roof repairs. And before the ink was dry, the house I'd owned for 20 years had already been stolen out from under me. Now, every Saturday morning without fail, I watched the man who engineered that theft push a lawn mower across my perfectly edged grass, wearing a neon yellow safety vest that's impossible to ignore because I had the words, "Mowed Down My Trust," embroidered across the back in giant block letters. And every time he hands me a fresh-cut invoice, the case number from his felony fraud conviction is printed right at the top. The same case number that followed him from the county jail to the beachside foreclosure, and all the way back to the property he once thought was his. I'm going to walk you through exactly how I pulled that off. From the first moment, a dead man's handwriting warned me not to trust my own family. Through a year of living in the belly of the beast, all the way to the day I reclaimed everything and turned my brother-in-law into the most humiliated groundsman in the entire state. My name is Emma, and 3 years ago I was a 44-year-old widow, still wearing the same cardigan I'd had on the day my husband Mark died. It was a gray wool cardigan he'd bought me at a thrift shop 10 years earlier, and I refused to wash it for months because it still carried the faint scent of his sandalwood soap. Mark and I had bought our home for $190,000 the summer we got married. A sturdy little 3-bedroom ranch on a 1/4 acre with a detached garage he'd planned to convert into an architect's studio. He was the kind of man who saw potential in old blueprints and could draw a sight line from a kitchen window that made a whole room feel like a sanctuary. He spent his weekends teaching me the difference between a Phillips and a Robertson screwdriver, how to sweat copper pipe with a propane torch. And one Christmas, he gave me a lock-picking practice set as a joke because I'd always been fascinated by puzzles. We spent that January working through increasingly difficult padlocks together, and by spring, I could rake a 4-pin tumbler in under 2 minutes, a skill I never imagined I would one day use to save my own life. When the cancer diagnosis came, I quit my job as a legal secretary at a firm that specialized in estate planning and spent 18 months navigating hospital corridors, insurance denials, and the quiet, furious prayer that I could trade every skill I had for one more decent day with him. I didn't trade enough. The funeral was small, held on a gray Tuesday, and the crowd that trickled back to my house afterward included Mark's younger brother Rick, the family golden boy who'd never held a job longer than it took a new credit card to arrive, and Rick's wife Melanie, a real estate agent whose entire personality was a ruthless catalog of name-brand handbags and the names she planned to drop while carrying them. My first mistake was letting them stay late after everyone else had gone. Melanie uncorked a bottle of my Chardonnay without asking, clinked her ice cubes, and offered to help me sort through Mark's clutter, a phrase I should have recognized as code for asset prospecting. By noon the next day, they'd positioned themselves in my living room, pulling books off shelves and flipping through photograph albums with a speed that made it clear they weren't looking for memories. I was still too hollow to argue. I wandered through the motions, tagging boxes for donation, until Rick held up a small wooden keepsake box with a rusty latch, the one Mark had kept on his nightstand my entire marriage and never once allowed me to open. The box was carved from dark walnut, and I now know it was the same box he'd used to store his father's old drafting tools before he kept the tools in his studio. It had a subtle burn mark on one corner from the year he'd accidentally set it too close to a candle, a scar I'd always run my thumb over when I dusted. Rick shook it. "What's this old junk?" he said, rattling. "Feels empty. Toss it." He dropped it into a cardboard bin marked landfill and moved on to the silverware. I waited until both of them were in the kitchen pawing through cabinets, then retrieved the box and slipped it under my sweater. That night, alone in the bedroom where Mark's side of the mattress still held the ghost of his shape, I worked the latch with a butter knife until it snapped open. Inside, there was no jewelry, no cash, just a single folded sheet of yellow legal paper covered in Mark's distinctive all-caps script, the same handwriting that used to leave me grocery lists with little cartoon hearts in the corners. It read, "If you're reading this, something happened. Do not trust them, Rick and Melanie. They've been circling since the moment I got sick. Save yourself. The house is protected, but only if you're smart. I love you." I read it 7 times, holding the paper so close my tears nearly smeared the ink, and by the 7th time the hollow feeling in my chest had solidified into something colder and sharper, a blade I didn't yet know how to hold. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when it matters and who never belonged in the will to begin with. When I came downstairs the next morning, still clutching the note in my pocket, I found Rick already at the kitchen table with a manila folder and a performance of concern so polished it could have earned him a daytime Emmy. He'd brewed a pot of coffee I hadn't asked for and set out my favorite mug. The chipped blue one Mark had made me a pottery class. Melanie stood behind him, scrolling on her phone with an expression of preoccupation that seemed to require practice. Rick launched into a well-rehearsed speech about how much he hated to bring up practical matters while I was still grieving, but the house needed immediate repairs. The insurance was lapsed, and the only way he could manage the contractors without constantly pestering me for signatures was if I added his name to the deed as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. He said joint tenant like it was a casual favor between siblings, like borrowing a lawnmower. Melanie leaned over and patted my hand, her acrylic nails tapping against my knuckles, adding that they'd already spoken to a title company, and all it would take was my notarized signature on a simple one-page quitclaim deed. I looked at the folder. I'd spent 8 years drafting legal correspondence, including grant deeds and trust conveyances, at the law firm, and I knew exactly what a quitclaim deed transferring a half-interest to a relative would do. But I also remembered Mark's note and the blade I was learning to carry. So I blinked a few times, let my voice go soft and confused, and said, "I'm so foggy right now, Rick. Can we just wait until the estate settles? I can't even remember where I put my checkbook." Rick's smile tightened, but he nodded and said, "Of course, we're just trying to help. Take your time." What he didn't know was that I had already driven to the county recorder's office that morning while the sky was still dark, clutching Mark's note and a half-formed plan. The building smelled like old paper and floor wax, and the clerk, a tired-eyed woman named Mrs. Delgado, pulled the property records with a gentle efficiency. She spread the documents across the counter, a warranty deed from the original purchase, a mortgage satisfaction from 5 years ago, and then, buried 3 years back, a document I had never seen. Mark had created an irrevocable trust, quietly, while I was at one of his chemo sessions, and transferred the entire property into it. The trust was named the Meadowlark Trust, after the street we lived on, and the language was precise. I was listed as the sole trustee and lifetime beneficiary, with the property held in an irrevocable spendthrift trust that could not be sold, encumbered, or transferred by any beneficiary acting in an individual capacity. Any conveyance of the property required my explicit consent as trustee, executed with a wet ink signature witnessed by 2 independent notaries and filed with a separate trust affidavit that had to match the trust's own recorded acceptance form. The house didn't even technically belong to me as an individual anymore. It belonged to the trust, and the trust belonged to me in a way that Rick's forgery-filled folder couldn't touch. Mrs. Delgado made me a certified copy, and I walked back to my car, with the paper weight of Mark's brilliance tucked against my ribs. I played foggy for 3 more weeks. Rick escalated gradually, first leaving a stack of plumbing estimates on my counter with sticky notes that said things like, "urgent foundation concerns," then bringing a mobile notary to the house unannounced, a woman who carried her stamp in a fanny pack and looked ready to notarize anything for a $20 fee. I claimed I had a migraine and couldn't read legal documents. Another time, Melanie invited me to lunch at a noisy cafe and slid a document across the table while I was chewing, expecting me to sign without reading. I pointed out that the date was wrong and she huffed, saying we'd do it later. The pressure built like a slow-boiling pot. Then, one afternoon, Rick cornered me in the garage with a document he claimed was simply a limited repair escrow authorization that would let him write checks from a joint maintenance account for the roof work. He had Melanie hovering behind him, her phone already recording a video she no doubt planned to edit into something incriminating. I read the single page carefully. It appeared legitimate, a boilerplate form for a limited power of attorney tied to a specific bank account. But the account number listed wasn't mine. I recognized the routing digits as a credit union in the next county over, one where Rick had previously been sued for unpaid personal loans. I almost called him out right then, but instead I remembered the lock on the keepsake box and the trust buried in the county records, and I signed it. I signed it with my left hand, just slightly trembling, my signature enough like my real one to fool a distracted notary, but with a telltale loop on the capital E that I'd never used on any official document, a variation I'd learned from a fraud case at the firm where a forensic document examiner had spotted a similar forgery based on letter height. I handed the pen back and said, "There, that should help with the roof." Rick beamed. Melanie stopped recording. They hugged me, and I let them. That night, after they'd gone back to their condo on the coast, I called a private investigator I'd found through a former colleague who now ran a boutique forensic accounting practice. His name was Leo, a retired state fraud detective who charged by the hour and had the kind of patience that comes from decades of watching grifters trip over their own greed. His office was cluttered with case files from insurance scams and real estate fraud, and he had a way of nodding that made you feel like he was already 3 steps ahead. I told him everything, and he told me to sit tight and start gathering every scrap of paper I could. The eviction notice arrived 10 days later. A sheriff's deputy knocked on my door at 7 in the morning and handed me a court order stating that the property had been sold at a trustee's auction following a default on a home equity line of credit I had supposedly taken out 6 weeks prior. The named borrower was Emma L. Carver, with a co-borrower Richard D. Carver, and the signature on the loan documents was a high-quality forgery that looked exactly like mine, except for that deliberate loop on the E that the forger had no reason to know about. The sale price was $140,000, a short sale to a shell company with a registered agent's address that matched Rick's beachside condo in Vista Del Mar. I stood on my own front porch with the deputy's badge glinting in the sun and felt the blade in my chest turn, a full rotation. The deputy looked genuinely sympathetic, but he had a job to do, and the documents were in order as far as the court's automated filing system was concerned. He gave me a copy of the writ and told me I had 72 hours to vacate. By noon, Rick and Melanie were at my door again, this time with an offer wrapped in pity. Melanie had brought a lasagna in a foil pan and set it on the counter like a peace offering. Rick shook his head with practiced sorrow and told me how terrible it was that I'd been taken advantage of, how they'd already consulted an attorney and discovered the loan was fraudulent, but the only way to avoid a lengthy court battle was if I came to live with them temporarily while they sorted everything out. Melanie even cried, dabbing her eyes with a tissue that smelled like the perfume counter of a department store I would never afford again. I packed a single suitcase, tucked Mark's note and the keepsake box inside my folded sweaters, and moved into their guest cottage, a converted pool house behind their main residence with a separate entrance and a view of the Pacific Ocean I couldn't stomach. The cottage had a small kitchenette, a daubed, and an air conditioning unit that rattled, but from the window I could see the edge of the main house's terrace where Melanie hosted her friends. Living in that cottage was like being submerged in a tank of toxic financial desperation, and I made myself a careful observer. The first week, I heard Rick on the phone at all hours, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper whenever I walked out to the main house to get a glass of water or return a borrowed broom. He'd pace the hallway outside his office, saying things like, "I need another 30 days," and the balloon payment isn't optional, before he'd notice me and hang up with a strained smile. The condo had a balloon mortgage he'd taken out 3 years earlier, assuming he could flip a property or inherit Mark's estate before it came due. And now, the final number was looming. I recognized the cadence of debt collection calls because my law firm had dealt with them enough times. Melanie's spending hadn't slowed. Boxes from high-end boutiques arrived almost daily, and she hosted brunches for her real estate colleagues, where she bragged about a family trust situation that was about to resolve in a major windfall, not knowing that I was listening from the hallway with a watering can in my hand. I smiled like a confused widow and made myself useful in small ways, fetching dry cleaning and watering their plants, all the while mapping the household rhythms, the location of the home office, the filing cabinet in the den, and the shredder they ran every Friday afternoon. Its grinding sound a reliable clock in my surveillance schedule. The break came on a Tuesday when the kitchen faucet started spraying water from the base of the handle, flooding the tile floor with a cold jet that soaked the cabinets. I heard Melanie shriek and Rick curse, and I walked in to find them both flailing at the water with dish towels, neither having the faintest idea where the shut-off valve was located. I watched them panic for a full minute before I knelt down, opened the cabinet under the sink, and twisted the cold water shut-off valve hard to the right. The spray stopped. Mark and I had renovated our entire house ourselves over a decade of weekends, and by the end, I could sweat copper pipe and replace a wax ring faster than most licensed plumbers. I told Rick I'd fix the faucet while he and Melanie were out grabbing coffee, and he looked at me like I'd performed a magic trick. I disassembled the handle, replaced the worn O-ring and cartridge with parts from the hardware store he paid for, and had the faucet working smoothly by noon. What he didn't see, as I was working under the sink, was the loose floorboard I discovered behind the disposal unit. The board lifted easily on a hidden hinge, and underneath was a shallow cavity where Melanie kept a fireproof safe, the kind you can buy for $80 at any office supply store, bolted to the subfloor and secured with a simple 4-digit combination wheel. I didn't have the code, but I did have a small leather case in my jewelry box, tucked under a necklace Mark had given me, containing a tension wrench and a rake pick I'd kept from our lock-picking hobby years earlier, untouched since that snowy winter. I waited until 3 a.m. on a night when their bedroom lights had been off for 2 hours, let myself into the main house with the key they'd given me for emergencies, and knelt in front of the safe. I inserted the tension wrench into the keyway, applied light rotational pressure, and started raking the pins. The small clicks echoed in the silent kitchen as each pin set, and within 90 seconds the plug turned and the lid opened. Inside were the originals of every document I needed. The quitclaim deed that Rick had supposedly notarized with a forged stamp, the loan application with my faked signature, and a notary seal from a woman who turned out to be Melanie's manicurist, and a thick folder of wire transfer receipts tracing the loan proceeds to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, then back into a domestic account held jointly by Rick and Melanie under the name Coastal Prosperity Partners. I also found a draft trust amendment, not yet fully forged, attempting to name Rick as co-trustee of the Meadowlark Trust, with my supposed signature already traced from the power of attorney I'd signed. I photographed every page with my phone, replaced the documents exactly as I'd found them, and walked out into the salt-heavy air, feeling like I could finally breathe. Later that week, I accessed Rick's home office one afternoon while Melanie was at a salon appointment, picking the lock on a filing cabinet with the same tools, and finding a folder containing the original notepad where he'd planned the entire scheme, including a timeline of when to approach me and a list of local judges he'd researched. I copied it all. Leo came through on his end with a full background investigation that uncovered 3 prior fraud complaints against Rick, all dismissed when the victims settled out of court, and a pattern of similar deed schemes targeting elderly relatives in 2 other states. He also confirmed that the trust was bulletproof. The county recorder had no record of any trustee consent affidavit for the transfer, meaning the foreclosure sale and the subsequent deed to Rick's shell company were void ab initio, legalese for never valid. The property had never been mine to give. It belonged to the trust, and the trust belonged to me in a way that made Rick's forgeries legally irrelevant. Leo contacted a sharp compliance officer at the credit union that had originated the fraudulent loan, a woman named Detective Mullen, who specialized in mortgage fraud for the state attorney general's office, and the 3 of us began building a criminal case that would require catching Rick in a final, irrefutable act. Before we triggered the trap, I needed to be absolutely certain Rick and Melanie were beyond redemption. I staged a minor construction accident in the guest cottage, loosening the brackets on a heavy shelf that held decorative books, then placing myself on the floor with the shelf angled to look like it had fallen across my legs. I used a small capsule of stage blood from a Halloween store, smearing it across my temple, and texted Rick a panicked message that said, "Help, shelf fell, can't move." He came in 40 seconds later. He saw me on the floor, called out my name once, and instead of checking my pulse or dialing 911, he stepped directly over my body and grabbed my purse from the nightstand, rifling through it until he found a folder I deliberately left visible, a folder labeled Meadowlark Trust Documents. He flipped through the pages, saw the trust language and the requirement for a separate trustee affidavit, and let out a sound I can only describe as a predator's frustrated snarl. Then he dropped the folder on my chest, stepped back over me, and walked out. The hidden camera Leo had installed in the smoke detector, a pinhole device with motion activation, captured the entire sequence. Melanie appeared in the doorway a moment later, looked down at me, and asked, "Did you find it?" Before they both left me there for 8 minutes until I regained consciousness on my own and called them from my cell phone, playing disoriented. The footage would later be entered into evidence as Prosecution Exhibit 14, and the jury would watch it in absolute silence, several of them visibly recoiling. I remember lying there, listening to their footsteps retreat, and feeling the last frayed thread of family loyalty inside me snap clean in half. The final confrontation came on a Thursday morning at the credit union's main branch. Rick had spent the previous week forging a new set of trust documents, this time trying to appoint himself as a co-trustee by faking a notarized amendment that he planned to have me sign under the guise of a routine update. He'd spent hours in his office with tracing paper and a printer, and the result was convincing enough that a casual observer might not have questioned it. He dressed me in a new blouse he'd bought, a pale blue one he said matched my eyes, and drove us to the parking lot while Melanie waited in the condo, already packing for a celebratory trip she'd booked with the anticipated loan disbursement. Inside the branch, a manager named Sandra, who was actually the undercover compliance officer working with Detective Mullen, ushered us into a private conference room. The table was set with water glasses and a neat stack of documents. Sandra smiled and said she'd give us privacy. Rick slid the trust amendment toward me, a pen already in his hand. "Just sign here, Emma. This lets me protect the trust for you." "It's the last piece, I promise." I looked at the paper, then at his face, then back at the paper. I saw the forged signature already on the amendment, supposedly mine, with the loop on the E from the power of attorney I'd signed. I picked up the pen, held it for a beat, and set it down again. "I know what a trust amendment looks like, Rick," I said, my voice steady for the first time since Mark died. "And I know the difference between a beneficiary and a forger. You're not even a co-trustee. You're a fraud, and you've been a fraud since the day you emptied Mark's nightstand of that keepsake box. My husband saw you coming from the moment he got sick, and he built a legal fortress around everything we owned. The house you thought you sold was never mine to give. It's held in an irrevocable trust that requires my deliberate, notarized, witnessed consent as trustee, and I'm not signing anything." Rick's expression shifted from fake warmth to genuine confusion to cold, calculating fury in the span of 2 seconds. "What are you talking about? Sign the paper, Emma." I stood up. "I'm not signing. And every deed you filed is void, every loan you took out is an open felony, and the Attorney General's Fraud Division has been watching you since the day you notarized my signature with Melanie's manicurist. They have the video of you stepping over my body, they have the wire transfers, and they have the draft amendment you forged last week." The conference room door opened, and Detective Mullen stepped in, badge visible on her hip, followed by 2 uniformed officers. Sandra, the manager, was already on the phone with the branch's security team, preventing any wire transfers from being processed. Rick lunged for the documents on the table, but an officer caught his wrist with a practiced grip and read him his rights. Melanie was arrested 40 minutes later at the condo, still wearing the outfit she'd planned for her non-existent vacation. The contents of her walk-in closet eventually seized and auctioned to partially satisfy the restitution order. The legal aftermath took 18 months, but every single day of it was worth it. Rick pleaded guilty to 2 counts of felony forgery, 1 count of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud. Melanie accepted a plea on lesser charges of aiding and abetting and testified against her husband, a decision that earned her no leniency from me, but did shorten her probation. The beachside condo, purchased with funds that could be directly traced to fraudulent loan proceeds against my property, was seized by the state and sold at auction, and the court ordered the entire proceeds paid to the trust, along with statutory treble damages that restored every penny of equity the trust had temporarily lost on paper, and added a punitive sum. The Meadowlark Trust's ownership of my home was legally reaffirmed through a quiet title action that I filed pro se, using my legal secretary skills to draft the complaint, and a judge signed the order after a single hearing where the bank's attorney didn't even contest. I walked back into my house on a bright Saturday morning, changed the locks to a set I'd bought with a new Medico deadbolt, and planted marigolds in the front beds, the same flowers Mark had loved for their resilience against pests. But the part you're all waiting for, the reason you're still listening, is what happened to Rick. I had choices. I could have let him serve his 18-month sentence and disappear into the kind of anonymous post-convict life where nobody checks your references. I could have accepted the restitution checks that would have taken him a lifetime to pay off and called it justice. But I wanted something more durable, something that would force him to look at the consequences of his choices every single week with the same regularity he'd once used to sharpen his manipulation skills. So I did what any self-respecting woman with a newly clear title and a gift for poetic humiliation would do. I started a lawn care company. I called it Meadowlark Lawn and Property Services, named after the trust, and I filed the LLC paperwork myself, using every scrap of procedural knowledge I'd absorbed during my legal secretary years. I drafted the articles of organization, secured the federal tax ID number, and opened a business banking account. I bought a used commercial mower, a Honda HRX with a 21-inch deck, a still trimmer, a backpack blower, and a small trailer with a custom vinyl wrap that featured a massive photo of my house. The one Rick had tried to steal, with the words "Restored Justice," one blade at a time, printed across the side in serif font. Then I petitioned the court, as part of Rick's supervised probation and community service requirement, to assign him to my company for the duration of his sentence. The petition outlined the need for consistent, supervised labor and included a letter from Leo confirming the therapeutic value of visible restitution. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched low on her nose, read my proposal, looked at Rick's prior fraud pattern, and approved it with a barely suppressed smile, noting on the record that it was creative but entirely within the bounds of the restitution statutes. Rick reports to my property every Saturday at 7 a.m., exactly on time because his probation officer monitors his ankle bracelet. He clocks in on a tablet app that tracks his GPS location, and the first thing he does is pull on his uniform vest, a bright safety yellow polyester garment I had custom manufactured by a local embroidery shop. The front reads, Meadowlark Lawn Care in crisp navy blue block letters. The back, in letters 3 inches tall and centered between his shoulder blades, says Mowed Down My Trust. He knows I'm watching from the kitchen window, but he can't see me smile behind the curtain. He mows the front lawn in precise stripes, using the technique I taught him from a YouTube tutorial, checking the blade height with a ruler because I inspect it. He edges the sidewalks with the trimmer, blows the clippings off the walkway, and bags everything into compostable bags I provide. He doesn't speak to me unless I ask a direct question about the work, and I make a point of inspecting the finished job with a clipboard and a little penlight, even though the lawn has never looked better. When he's done, he generates an invoice on a templated carbon copy pad I designed myself and had printed at a local shop. The invoice lists the date, the services performed, his hourly rate of exactly $1 above minimum wage, and at the bottom, in the same font as the logo, the full legal citation of his fraud case. State v. Richard D. Carver, Case No. 21 CF 004783, 4 counts felony fraud. He signs the bottom of each copy, and I keep one in a filing cabinet in order, a growing archive of his penance. My neighbors know the story. Some have hired Meadowlark for their own lawns, not because they need the service, but because they enjoy the quiet theater of watching Rick mow yet another yard wearing that vest, his head down, his former cockiness eroded into a permanent stoop. A local news station did a puff piece on the business, and the image of Rick pushing a mower with the case number visible on his invoice went semi-viral on social media, generating enough new clients that I had to buy a second mower and hire an actual, non-felonious employee named Javier to keep up with demand. Rick works alone, always, and I make sure his schedule never overlaps with anyone who might befriend him. The business now supports itself, and I've even set up a small scholarship fund for widows facing foreclosure, using a portion of the punitive damages. There's a strange peace in the ritual. Every Saturday, I wake up before dawn, make a pot of coffee in the kitchen Mark, and I remodeled, and stand at the window watching the man who tried to take everything push a blade across grass that will always be mine. I don't feel anger anymore, not really. I feel something closer to a sad, satisfied patience, the kind that comes when you realize that the deepest vengeance isn't about inflicting pain so much as it is about requiring the person who wronged you to spend the rest of their days proving, one careful chore at a time, that you are the one who decides what a place is worth. What Mark wrote in that little box saved me. Without his foresight, without that trust, I might have lost the house and never gotten it back. But I also saved myself, step by step, with a fake faint and a lock pick and a perfectly timed refusal to sign. I think now about all the other widows, the lonely relatives, the trusting siblings who get sweet-talked into similar messes and don't have a quiet architect husband who spent his final lucid hours building a legal fortress around the life they built together. The system isn't designed to catch these predators. It's designed to process paperwork, and the predators know exactly which forms to file. You have to meet them on the paperwork, outthink them, and then, if you're lucky and a little bit ruthless, make them mulch your garden beds for the next 3 years while the neighborhood watches. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Leave your story in the comments. And if this video gave you the same quiet satisfaction I get every Saturday morning when I see that yellow vest trudging across the lawn, hit like and subscribe. Let's turn your betrayed trust into something that grows. I'll see you in the next one.